Employer versus Personal Responsibility, that's our next panel. Please welcome to the stage Sarah Hughes, who is the CEO for the Centre of Mental Health, Gian Power of TLC Lions, Dr. Ellie Cannon, who we heard from before, GP, author and broadcaster, Dr. Alex Morris from Mitie, and Richard Stanbury from our partner Direct Line Group.
Hello everybody, welcome to I think the last panel session of the day, and we've got a tough job to keep you all awake, so let's do our best. Let us know if you want to kind of raise the volume or something. I think people can hear us at the back. So this session today is very much about employer versus individual responsibility, about mental health in the workplace. We have an extraordinary group of individuals here who are going to help us think about these issues in terms of the individual's experience, but also about the workplace and what employers need to think about. So I'm firstly going to go to you, Gian, who has very gracefully offered to tell us his story. So I'm going to hand over to you and basically ask you why you're here in terms of the lived experience.
Sure, no, thank you. So yeah, to give you some context as to why I'm sat here today, I started my career at PwC, and that was in 2014, and life was really good. I was working in the city, family life was great. I was really, aspiring to build up a good brand at work, and performance was everything. And if somebody had said mental health, well-being, inclusion, I probably wouldn't have considered it a thing back then. And then I realized how wrong I was in 2015. And it was May 2015 when everything just suddenly changed for me. When from one day to the next, I discovered that my dad had been murdered overseas. And suddenly, the life that I was living that was very normal suddenly came crashing down before my eyes. But thankfully, after a while off work, I had to come back to work because I knew that it's almost respite if you have a workplace that looks after you. And it was thanks to the leaders, the directors, who really kind of went out of their way to empathize, to care. And the knock-on effect of that was I'd do anything for them and I'd go above and beyond. But I had to put a lot of different things in place to look after myself. But that's kind of my story, and the investigation continues to this day, dealing with the police, the Foreign Office, and all these different areas. And I guess just to sum up there is that the reason I realized my mental health was so important to me was when I did go back to work, and I'll never forget two things happening, which was I walked back into the PwC office here in London Bridge, and a colleague of mine who I'd started with in 2014 had committed suicide. And I just remember standing at the bottom and looking up and thinking, Gian, you've got to take your mental health seriously, because all this stuff that you're trying to balance at the moment, if you don't balance it effectively, you don't know what's going to happen with these thoughts that are going around your mind. So that's when I kind of started putting strategies together that I still put in place today, and I'll happily share them in a bit with you as well.
I mean, thank you. And I think although your story is unusual, I think the bit that most people will connect with in the room is the kind of impact of things that happen outside of work that absolutely impacts the workplace. And so I think you talk very beautifully about the things that you did. And I think we'll come back to talking about those specific things. But the point you just made about work being a possible respite is something that you, Ellie, absolutely agree with. And I also think that work, oddly, is a bit of like a health outcome, actually, and is that important to our well-being. Can you tell us about your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we know if you look at research that worklessness is not good for people, and that's something that I see in practice when I look after people who are mentally unwell, either as a result of their job or they feel they can't work. Once you've had a week or two off, even a day off, it's very hard to climb back onto that treadmill. It's sort of Sunday night blues plus, and it's very, very hard to go back and to do that. And then you sort of work slips away. And the reason that work is good for people is that it provides structure, it provides routine, it provides relationships. and it provides scheduling, that all of which we know are protective for people. And paradoxically, actually, when you look into it, actually that's even the case if your work is stressful. So even if you've got a very high workload and tight deadlines and it's busy and you feel the stress, work actually, in the holistic sense and in the bigger picture, is actually good for people.
That's a really interesting point. I was at a very interesting event last week with the City Mental Health Alliance. Is anybody a member in the room? Good, I can see a few hands, that's great. And one of the presenters said that actually when she was very poorly, she was performing really well, and that was partly because it was anxiety driven, so you wouldn't have known that she was poorly, and that the worst thing that her employer could have done was send her home. So don't send me home was her message. What do you think about that?
I think that's right, and I think actually that's really, thankfully, sort of the way things have moved in this space, in the occupational health space. So years ago, when I started as a GP a decade ago, we used to sign people off with what's called a sick note. So the idea was that people were ill, and therefore you don't work, and that was it. You either were well enough to work, or you were too ill to work. Now we've had a change in culture in the last couple of years with what's called the fitness to work statement. So now you actually get a fit note, and you may be too ill to work, but also a very crucial part of that is to be able to write, actually this person can come to work, but they may need altered hours, you may need to take this into account, you may need to take that into account. So there's a whole move actually to keeping people in work for that sort of positive protection that it can offer.
Thank you. Dr. Alex, it's really interesting that most organisations now really think about health and wellbeing programmes. They talk about exercise, they talk about connection. I'm less likely to run a marathon, but I'm more likely to have a coffee morning with my colleagues, I guess, to kind of maintain those connections. But people are really hard to change, and behaviours are quite entrenched. So what do employers do to help their employees take up the opportunities that staff are offering? So I'm not going to want a free gym membership, for instance, but I might be persuaded to do some meditation.
Okay. Well, this is exactly it, and I think we are, as employers, really looking at behaviour change from one perspective, which is we are providing people with a lot more information about their mental health and their thriving. But if we look at behaviour change itself, that actually only really targets one part of the way that people change their behaviours. So from a kind of theoretical point of view, and I won't go too deeply into it, but when human beings decide on any kind of behaviour change, we have two processes going on. So we have the deliberative process, which is that very rational, conscious, information-driven side. But we also actually have all the automatic processes that are going on. So it's that very fast thinking. If any of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book about thinking fast and slow, it's that issue between the kind of the slow deliberative and the automatic. And what we find is that many organisations are then going for that slow part as if we're all these really, really rational people, but we're not. And I think really as employers, we need to start thinking about how can we also start hitting the automatic processing? How can we change our environments to support the individual with those skills? So we know from an individual point of view that for behaviour to change, we need to be embedding that. We need to be doing it over and over again on a daily basis. And I think that sometimes as employers, we bring in certain strategies. We have maybe, if we're really lucky, we might have a monthly focus on our well-being and mental health. Many have a mental health awareness day. yes, we are giving people information, but that's not giving them any opportunity to actually practice these skills and make it a habit. So to some extent, we really, really need to come back to basics and be thinking about what can we do as employers and what can we do as individuals on a daily basis to protect our mental health as well. That actually it's not just about looking after people when they've fallen over, but what kind of resilient behaviours can we be doing that are protective and can really help us thrive. So from a very, very basic point of view, things like we know that we need to enable people to actually have goals. They then need to be able to plan how they are going to achieve those behaviours, when they are going to fit them into their day. We need to get people to think about what are the barriers to those, what are some of the rewards for that, because as human beings we are very, very motivated by our reward system, and every time we do a behaviour and we succeed at that, we get a nice little dopamine hit, which motivates us to do it over and over again. Now, companies can also start thinking about what are the barriers. We need to start talking about that more so that people can do a lot more if-then planning. So if this happens, I can do X, not just be providing information. I think
that's a really interesting point, because one of the things I think employers practice a lot is a kind of one-off intervention, like you say, a well-being day or a kind of month where we do yoga in the garden or something. That was lovely. But I think there's something much more intrinsic to what we're talking about today. So in my last organisation, and soon the organisation I run now, I introduced what's called the Green Hour, and that comes from the digital world. So coming from a charity, it's very unusual to kind of think about what incentives people need to look after their well-being. So if you're a working mum, like I am, it's really difficult to think, how am I going to go to a yoga class when I've got to go home, get my kids to bed, and then maybe talk to my husband, if I feel like it. How am I going to manage all of that? So it'd be really good if my employer created the space. So the Green Hour is basically that, a gift that employers give to their staff, time every week that they must do something for their well-being. So my staff used to say, right, I'm off now and I'm greening it. And what they meant by not smoking, what they meant by that was that they were few too knowledgeable laughs in the room, I noticed there. What they meant by that was that they're going to take their Green Hour to go to a yoga class, they're going to go for a walk, they're going to have lunch with a girlfriend, and that managers would be able to ask them at any point, what did you use your Green Hour for? And you can't say, there were rules, so you couldn't say, I caught up on work, or I did the housework, or something like that. It had to be absolutely for you. But organisations need to cost it out, and they need to kind of factor it in. Just as a point of reference, the Green Hour, you give a Green Hour, you get 5 back. So it's, economically wise. Richard, coming to you, we need to think about kind of employer versus individual responsibility. And as an employer myself, it's always tricky to navigate those boundaries. And I'd be really interested to hear from you about what things that you do in your organisation to create the conditions in which people can talk about their mental health needs, and how do you support both them to do that, but also to take responsibility?
Sure. So I think in a number of sessions today I've talked about the importance of the overall culture of the organisation, and we all know that changing culture is not something that happens overnight. But at a macro level, I think it really is about publicising and senior people within the organisation being comfortable about talking through their own challenges and how they've got through them. And that approach cascades down through the organisation. And also supporting events like this and introducing the concept of mental health into broader initiatives as well, because I think it's very easy to compartmentalise things and say, well, that's diversity, that's CSR, that's... But actually, they all influence each other. And so it's looking for the areas of overlap where you can work with different programmes. Then at an individual level, what's been said earlier was really important, really resonated with me, because we've tried to introduce what we call working towards wellness plans, which are to try and tailor it around the individual, so that when an individual needs support, the manager, it's in essence a structured conversation, and people who have used Mind's wellness action plan or have heard Johnny Benjamin talking about a wellness recovery action plan. It's a similar sort of thing, but a structured conversation. And part of it is around, how will I, as your manager, notice that you're struggling? What do we say to others when that happens? What can we do? What can you do? And let's think about how we can actually enact that and what is the goal which we're trying to aim for. And so that's just one thing, a piece of support that we've put in place for our managers. So I guess to link back to the wider question, I think training is really important for managers. I think of the approach that we've taken is more to say, let's train our managers primarily. Then we introduced mental health first aiders in a similar way to physical first aiders, so one on every floor in every building. And now we're starting to build our resilience proposition. The idea being is when an individual has that resilience toolkit and then they want to talk to their manager about it, the manager we know is Hope can have a proper conversation about it, and there's also someone else that they can talk to from a mental health first aider as well. So I'm not saying that our way is the best way, it's just a way that works for us. And I think lastly, employers need to find a way that works for them and that resonates with their own organisation, rather than just taking an off-the-shelf model and dropping it in, because that won't work very well.
No, helicopter kind of approaches rarely work. There has to be a kind of bespoke kind of thinking through what your organisation does, the impact it has on individuals, and therefore how you need to respond. We at the Centre for Mental Health about 10 years ago were the first people to put a price tag on mental illness and the workplace. And we conducted a significant economic analysis of not just absent, people who are absent, but people who are also present and not performing. And this is a really difficult issue for employers to tackle, and can be the kind of straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of relationships. And I wonder if any of our panel members have anything to say about that kind of dynamic. Whilst I think I would agree being at work is better than not being at work, I also have to accept if I'm at work and I'm not performing, the impact on my colleagues could degrade the team's mental health. So how do we manage that dynamic?
I think when I came back to work, one thing PwC did for me was they just eased me in. They said there is no pressure, you can take as many weeks off. I had 3 months out, but I came back 2 days a week and then 3 days a week. And there's no one size fits all for everybody. It was a case of the right managers, leaders listening to me, empathizing, caring again, and just being kind, good people. And they said, what works for you? And we put a plan in place, but we constantly change with that, because in the times that are the most difficult, you don't know how you're going to feel next week or next month. So they constantly move that with me. So I think that was something that was so important, that they understood the need for that and kind of staggered me in. But then they pushed for me to, call a therapist. Somebody literally gave me the number and said, go and call them. Like, Gian, go into that booth and then come back and see me. They didn't have to do that. No. They did that because they wanted to. And again, like you said before, we can see through this now. You can see through a leader who takes you into a room because it's a tick box exercise, versus those who take you for a coffee and it's coming from the heart. And then you'll do anything for them when you're chucked on a project. You'll go above and beyond.
Yes, no, absolutely. Ellie, what is the kind of, I guess, the line between, when work is good and when it isn't good for you? You obviously talk to hundreds of people about this very dilemma, and I know that, people will come in and say, I do need to be off work. What happens during those conversations? What are the kind of indications that perhaps actually this person needs to stay at home?
I think it's very tricky, and I would echo sort of what I've heard both in this panel and the other ones I've been, that it has to be an individual approach. I would say very much that when I started in general practice a decade ago, my sort of default position was to write a sick note, give them the time off. That was obviously going to sort of be the panacea that they needed. I think thankfully now, because we don't have this binary approach anymore, you're either on at work or not at work, and what sort of Gian's described with, going in 2 days a week, maybe only going in a half day. I will always sort of try and encourage people to do that, but it is incredibly dependent on, obviously, managers, teams, how the person feels, where they are in their career. And it has to be tailor-made. And also what's sort of critical really is what other help they can get. So I wrote a book earlier this year, Is Your Job Making You Ill?, which looks at the personal strategies that people can undertake to protect themselves or to even heal themselves when they're in a position of mental health, which could be from their work. And actually, a lot of the problem is that people can't always access the treatment, or they can't have the time off. They don't have a boss like Gian had who will go with this. They can't access NHS therapy. Their company might be very small and they don't have therapy on offer. So we had to look at personal strategies for people and what they could do in their own lives, whether it's their sleep or whether it's their exercise and their yoga or building their own social scaffolding, their own relationships. So it's very, very much tailor-made to the individual. And also, you'll know, GP appointments are very quick. They're only 10 minutes, and it can take 2 or 3, even 4 appointments with a GP who's consistently seeing you to even come up with some sort of plan that will work for that person in front of you.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, I think I'm stuck on the issue about what happens when the individual doesn't disclose, and that you're left with a dilemma about how do you approach that person. Alex, what would you say? How do we approach somebody who perhaps isn't ready to disclose but is clearly not well? I mean, what do we do?
There is no simple answer to that one. I think if we have a culture where we keep showing that we are available for that conversation, we can't force people to disclose what's going on for them, but actually being able to just be a bit more human and, constantly asking twice, how are you doing? How are you really doing? Just having those very human conversations, I think, so that they feel that we're there. If they want to talk, if and when they want to talk, or whether it's a case of, finding out whether there's somebody else that they can talk to. If it's not us, who else could they talk to? But I think it's a really tricky one because we cannot force somebody to do that if they're struggling. That is still the individual's responsibility, really, in that situation.
Absolutely. We were talking earlier, Gian, about introducing the language of compassion and empathy to the workplace that's not just about mental health, because actually there are lots of factors that affect our well-being, family illness, childcare, all sorts of pressure, both outside of the workplace but inside the workplace. But how do we introduce that language of compassion and empathy? I mean, when perhaps we're in an organisation, I should imagine that no organisation in this room, because you're here, would resist using such language. That's obviously an expectation. But what if you were in an organisation that didn't? What would we do?
I think something that's so important is the tone that's set from the top. I say this time and time again because I've come across kind of CEOs, C-suite level, and they'll come to me or they'll reach out privately online and say, this has happened in my life, do you think I should share it? And I say, when you feel the time is right, please do share it, because suddenly you become this human person, people become more loyal to you as an individual, more loyal to you as a brand, and people will respect you and go above and beyond for you, so there's that. But I think to build compassion and empathy, it comes from storytelling. The more people in the right environment feel courageous enough to speak out and share what they've been through, because everybody, and I believe everybody in this room, has a story, if only we're willing to take the time and to listen more. Because when you listen, people will share, and that's how we can get more people, the individuals, to feel, I can share too. And I feel that we have to do that through storytelling, and that's kind of why I left my job at PwC, because I'm so passionate about igniting this emotion and bringing people who can share stories to encourage other people in organisations to do so too.
No, thank you. I absolutely agree at 100% with that. But what about the often said response, which is, if we start doing this, and Richard, you might have heard this a number of times, we're opening the floodgates. What do you think that's true?
So I think it's true that you hear it a lot, but I don't think it's true that it opens any floodgates. And you hear, that's just another way of saying I don't want to do it.
Quite.
And so I think you need to challenge that for what it is. Coming back to the compassion thing, and one of the points made earlier was the importance of caring. And most people are caring people. Most people don't come to work not to be caring. And so you give them the space and they'll fill it. So what can we definitely all influence is how we respond to things. And if enough people start, even in the most austere organisation, if individuals start to be caring, the organisation becomes caring. And so we can influence that as employees and people. And I think we shouldn't wait for someone else to be caring.
Quite.
But I also think it's one, the right thing to do as a good person, but there is a business case that those leaders who are more caring, people will bond with, and productivity is then boosted in those teams, versus if you crack the whip at someone, I don't want to work for them, and I'll actively try and go to work with another leader. So I think it is just so important in two senses.
I think if I can add at this point, sort of from my own sort of experience as a workplace, so I've worked in an NHS GP clinic sort of my whole career, and you will all know the pressures on general practice, the pressures on the NHS. I would expect if you try to make a GP appointment this afternoon, you'd probably be offered one in about 3 or 4 weeks, which is sort of the standard in my practice as well. And yet, where I work, because of the very heavy burden on us emotionally as GPs and the heavy workload, about 4 or 5 years ago, a colleague of mine suggested that in the middle of our morning clinic, we actually blocked off 2 patient appointments and sat down and had coffee together. Now, you're talking about a GP surgery. On average, in one day, I will see or speak to 40 patients. So to think that we could have the time off to block off 2 and have a coffee, it sort of seemed very decadent. And yet, it's actually been incredibly powerful. It has cost us nothing. There's no money, no resources in the NHS, so it has cost us nothing. It has had no effect on appointment times or appointment access for patients. But it's had an enormous effect on us as GPs and us as a team. And we have the opportunity, it's totally informal, it's just to be caring. We might talk about what TV we watched last night, we might talk about how upsetting we find our most recent consultation, but it's just given us that platform, just that space, very short period of time, just to speak and just have the opportunity to care for each other, even if that is just me asking my colleague if they want milk in their coffee.
Thank you. I mean, if anyone's interested, there is a hashtag called Shiny People on Twitter, and it's not just for people like me with shiny faces. It's about people who are not burdened by the kind of, the cynical workplace pressures. So it's people who call themselves shiny people to maintain that kind of caring, that kind of dynamic. So look out for them. They're very interesting people. I'm going to get in trouble because we're going to be running out of time in a minute. Bad chairing. So we've got one question that I'm going to ask from the slide deck, and I'm going to choose the one that has the most likes. Yeah. If a colleague has mental health symptoms, when is it suitable to manage performance as an issue? As managers are scared of being accused of not being sensitive, but there is a business need. Big question.
Okay.
So, Richard, over to you.
Yes, I thought that might be coming my way. So there isn't a right or wrong answer to this, and there isn't a formulaic answer to it either. I think that in any situation where someone's not able to perform the role to the standard that you need to perform it to, you need to think about what help does that person need. Certainly in severe cases where there's something that's considered as a disability, there's a legal obligation in itself to consider reasonable adjustments. But I think that's just a legal way of kind of trying to introduce a humanistic approach of saying, actually, what help do you need? So I think that it's really important that as part of that conversation, you're thinking about, actually, am I doing everything that I can in order to help this person deliver what they need, what needs to be done. But ultimately, and you've put the support in place, I would think more holistically about it in terms of maybe they can't do this role now, but they could do another role either on a temporary basis or a permanent basis, is to explore as many other opportunities or avenues as possible. But there will be some situations where none of that is possible, all of the support is in place, the individual's doing whatever they can to help as well, but that ultimately it does need to go through the company's normal performance management processes in a supportive way.
And often you find people want to be treated fairly. They don't want to have kind of special circumstances. Right. We have come to the end of our session, and there are other questions, and I think all of us are on Twitter.
Instagram.
Okay. So you can chase up any one of us to follow up some of these really important questions. I'm interested in the fit note one myself, so we'll do that.
The answer to that is no.
Yeah, that's for you, definitely. So thank you very much for sharing all of your knowledge with us today. So thank you to our panel.
And another thank you again from me. I will keep it very brief so you can all leave on time today. Our next session starts at 4:30, so in 10 minutes' time, and it's incredibly inspiring, so please do stick around. Thank you.